I don't think we could do justice to the title of this session of Decolonizing Social Emotional Learning without actually acknowledging that we are on stolen land. And that for those of us who are settlers, that we benefit from that theft. And so I just want to take a moment for us to acknowledge that and to sit with that and to be with it and to allow that to be in this space and allow it to shape our conversations today. I'm going to guide us through a little bit of a grounding, centering exercise that is an adaptation of something that I've learned from generative somatics. This is an organization that does trainings for movement leaders, organizers, just folks who are interested in creating change on a structural level, but also at an internal level, which I think speaks to what we're trying to talk about here today. It is an invitation, so you get to decide how you want to participate. I'm just going to guide us through 3 different dimensions in our bodies. It's a way for us to disrupt, I think, oftentimes the ways in which spaces like this, these kinds of conferences, train us, condition us to kind of speak from our heads, but not from our hearts and from our bodies. And so how do we disrupt that violence by actually coming back to our bodies as a way to acknowledge our full humanity in this space, okay? So if you would like to, you can actually stand or do this in whatever position. I'm gonna do this seated. So let's just take one collective breath together. So inhaling and then exhaling. So if you could start to feel the ground beneath you on your feet, if you're seated or if you're standing, and just allowing your breath to really root into the earth that is holding us. So using the breath to acknowledge the land that we're on, to give gratitude for the land that holds us, that sustains us, to ask for permission to be here. And from that sense of rootedness, I'm going to ask us to organize our bodies in the dimension of length. So from your feet, starting to sense your legs, noticing how your legs feel, perhaps shaking them a little bit if they need to wake up. Then starting to work your way up to your back. And then allowing yourself to give a little bit space in between the vertebra. Lengthening from the bottom of the back to the middle, to the top. And then all the way to the top, the crown of your head. And in this dimension, what generative somatics asks us to do is to feel dignity in our length. So how can we not just think about what dignity is, but actually feel it in our bodies? Whatever it is you're coming with this morning, how do we feel dignity in that? And then now I'm going to ask you to organize our bodies in another dimension, which is width, which is my favorite part. This is where we get to take up space in our bodies. So starting to feel what's in between your shoulders, maybe allowing the shoulders to fall a little bit more, soften. Sensing what you feel in between the sides of your bodies, your hips, even stretching out and taking up more space if that feels good to you. Sensing in between your ears, in between your feet. In this dimension of width, we practice connection. So connecting to the space that we take up, but also connecting to the space that other folks take up around us. So I forgot to mention in generative somatics, when we do centering, the invitation is actually to open your eyes, if that feels good. Because oftentimes in meditation or some practices, we close our eyes. But here the practice is, how do we get in touch with ourselves without disappearing the world that is around us, right? And also, how do we get in touch with those around us, our surroundings, our environment, without disappearing ourselves? So how do we connect? So width is about connecting to here, but also connecting to all the amazing folks in this space. And then finally, let's organize our bodies in the dimension of depth. So starting to feel the backs of your body. So the back of your head, back of your back, back of your legs, back of your feet. Noticing any tension, any numbness. Not necessarily trying to change anything, but just allowing it to be here. And when we feel into our backs, we can also feel into who has our backs. Perhaps those of us who are on Zoom, there's folks who are taking care of the babies, our loved ones, so that we can be present here. So sensing into who has our back, who has mentored us, who has shaped us. Also, when we sense into our back, we can also sense into our lineages, our ancestors, those who come before us. Perhaps in this time, even folks who we have lost, things, people, places that we are grieving. And just allowing that to be in this space, to be in our bodies, to be present with that. And then moving from the back of our bodies through to the front. So noticing how you feel in your face, your forehead, in between your eyebrows, your cheeks, your jaw, your chest, belly. And then just asking yourself, in this present moment, what brings you here? What is it that you care about? Again, oftentimes these spaces in schools, things outside of us try to determine what is important to us. But in this moment, from a felt sense of dignity, of connection, of reciprocity, of self-determination, why is it that you are here today? What brings you here? Who do you care about? And let that take shape in you. Awesome. So just take a few more breaths. If you closed your eyes during this, you might want to slowly open them, look around. And then I'm going to invite folks in the chat box to just share maybe 1 or 2 words of how you're feeling, if that feels good to you to share. And then also, whose land are you tuning in from today? Okay, so maybe just a minute to share that in the chat box. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you for sharing where you are coming from. Thank you for sharing how you're feeling. Thank you. And yes, I forgot to mention, I'm calling in from Tongva land, and I am feeling calm.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely an amazing experience. And thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you all in the chat for responding and providing acknowledgement. I'd like to invite the panelists to please introduce themselves and just let us know what you'd like us to know about you as we are getting ready before we start in with our first question. And Dina, would you like to go first?
Sure, yes.
Awesome.
I'm Dina Simmons, and I'm the founder of Liberate Ed, a liberatory approach to social and emotional learning, racial justice, and healing, and also a inaugural scholar in residence at Loyola University of Chicago's Institute for Racial Justice. But those positions do not define me. What define us is how we interact and treat people. So I'm happy to be here today and to share about how we decolonize SEL.
Thank you so much. Laurea, would you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laurea Martinez. I'm a white Hispanic woman. I'm an immigrant and the first generation to graduate from college in my family. I'm the author of Teaching with the Heart in Mind, a recently published book on SEL for educators. And my work is focused on supporting schools and teachers to implement SEL in their schools and their communities and products. And I work at Teachers College, Columbia University as well, supporting aspiring principals to develop emotional intelligence. And I'm very grateful to be in conversation with all of you this morning.
Thank you so much, Laurea, and thank you for your patience as I misspoke your name the first time. Stephanie, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am Stephanie, Steph Carriaga, if I know you. And I am a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. I am also an assistant professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills in Carson, California, on Tongva land. I'm also a founding member of the People's Education Movement, and I see People's folks here. Shout out to People's. And my lineage comes through Baguio and Pangasinan in the Philippines. And I'm just really happy to be here. I know my homie colleague, Patrick Kamangyan, was supposed to be here as well. I just want to give a shout out to him. He wasn't able to join us because he's not feeling well. So sending love to Cam, and we will try to do justice to his work here as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Zoe, would you like to give a brief introduction to yourself?
Yeah, Tatsmewi, good morning. My name is Zoe Hayego Strong. I'm a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe. Our traditional name is Nimipu. And I'm a mother of two boys that are half Black, half Native, and been married for 23 years now to my husband, Max Strong. My family is, I come from the Hayego and the Pinkham family on my father's side, and the Ankeny and the Benelli from my mother's side. And it's just a privilege to be here. I'm an assistant professor in educational psychology at Washington State University. And I'm there, I'm in the executive director for tribal relations and lead a Center for Native American Research and Collaboration. So one of my passions is social emotional learning from an Indigenous perspective. And I serve on the Native American Advisory Board for OSPI in Washington State, and specifically looking at SEL. So it's a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Excellent. Daniel, did you want to do a brief introduction to yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm kind of already slightly did. Daniel Sajinda. I am currently a professor at California State University, Stanislaus, where I teach in the Department of Liberal Studies and Teacher Education. And I'm also the department chair over there. So I live in the Bay Area in Richmond, California. And I self-identify as Thai American. Thank you.
Excellent. I am Lara Irvin-Kassab. I am an assistant professor in teacher education at San Jose State, but really I'm a teacher. I come from a long line of strong women who are educators. And I am legally blind and also neurodiverse. And so I'd also like to offer the opportunity for Elizabeth to introduce herself if she would like to. She is our interpreter today, and I want to thank her for the work that she is doing. It must not be easy to keep up with all of us. So thank you so much, Elizabeth. And if you'd like a moment to introduce yourself. She's okay. Okay, thank you so much. Awesome. Then let's dive into the very first question. And the first question is, how does social emotional learning risk becoming white supremacy with a hug? And please feel free to respond and have a dialogue amongst yourselves. It's the importance today is the conversation.
So I'll start, since white supremacy was a hug. Something as a matter of fact, I first said that in a keynote in North Carolina, in Charlotte, Mecklenburg district, and it was a room full of mostly women of color, you know. And I'm usually not in a room where I'm in a room with other people who look like me. Usually when I walk into a room, I'm walking into a room, especially educators, who don't look like me, white women. And for me, when I walk into spaces with mostly white women, I bring sort of the trauma of being bullied in high school, which was an all-girls school, predominantly white school. So for me, I was talking, and I felt like the universe, came to me, and I said, we got to be careful that SEL doesn't become white supremacy with a hug. And then I said it in an interview, and that's how people in these streets started to use it. So that's sort of that's where it came from. But I think it's important to know that I said it in a space where I felt safe first. And I think that is crucially important, because when it made it to the universe, I did get my hand slapped for saying that. And I think what is the reason why I say that's important is, how do these spaces that are supposed to be safe and nurturing action and doing the SEL work, how do those spaces actually perpetuate white supremacy? And so when we think about education and the foundation of education, it's important for us to think of, for us to understand that the foundation of our education in this country is a foundation of whiteness. And so if we could put anything in for SEL, and everything in education risks turning into white supremacy with a hug. I don't know any BIPOC, Black, Indigenous person of color who doesn't have scars from being told that they are not enough, or they're too much in the spaces that we're supposed to nurture. We're supposed to be nurtured in the places we're supposed to thrive. So with SEL in the same system that is unwell has that risk too, if we don't apply an anti-racist and an anti-oppressive and anti-bias lens. We have to put an equity lens on SEL. Otherwise, we're just going to keep doing what we do in education. Just put a Band-Aid on it and we'll be fine. Just go ahead, put a Band-Aid on. Just, when Daniel first talked, right, when he first said something, he said, I went to the school and the school principal said, I need to figure out what we're going to do with children's behavior, right? SEL, when I speak to BIPOC, institutions and schools, they say, well, yeah, we need SEL so that these Black and brown kids learn how to manage themselves and they learn self-control, right? So now it becomes a form of policing, right? And so I think and then when I'm talking to districts that are well-to-do and mostly white, SEL is about college and career readiness. So we've decided that SEL fits into a system and it can be used as a weapon against people who look like me. And so now I will unapologetically say that if we do not apply an anti-racist lens, a healing-centered lens to SEL, it is white supremacy with a hug.
Thank you, Dana. Just adding to that, I was thinking of an example, and if you consider one core indicator of SEL is the ability to manage one's emotions, and developmentally, they'll they'll say that, we should be able to manage, or a child should be able to manage their emotion in appropriate context, is a benchmark indicator by grade school. But you think about the bigger question is who is determining what is appropriate emotion in an appropriate context? And so if you think about schools and educators with what is their goal and intent to roll out SEL, you will get often a misunderstanding of SEL is meant to, provide structure to the school, manage the classrooms. But when you think about that, it's not dealing with the heart and the emotion. And often it's more about cognition and how do you control your emotion versus really understanding. And emotion is so complex. I think about, for instance, we talk about our Black and Brown students and Indigenous students, students of color that are going through extreme trauma. So what does emotion look like? What's an appropriate emotional response for someone that's going through extreme trauma at school? That should look different, and it will look different amongst different communities. I think about Indigenous communities, for instance, how we deal with grief and trauma is we spend time with our family. We take time away from school. Well, school wants us to be there. And so we get punished if, we don't show up. I think about also family. We call our cousins, our brothers and sisters, our aunts and our uncles. And so there's, in many Black or Brown communities, there's this connection to family that is deep. And so when a cousin passes away, an educator might not understand that. They might think, well, that's just, and this is often what I've heard from sometimes mainstream is, oh, well, it's just my cousin that passed away, so don't worry. They almost dismiss, like, I want to comfort somebody, and they dismiss it. Or it's my grandparent and they lived a long life, so it's not that big of a deal. But when we lose an elder, we lose culture, language, the loss is deep. And so that emotion is going to look different at school. And I think we have to have those safe spaces to not try to control. Like, I think our culture in America is very much, let's not show a lot of emotion. Let's not show grief. Let's not wail, cry, scream. That wouldn't be appropriate in a public context. But for us, I think that's where white supremacy can really control and shut down emotion. And we're seeing the damage of it in our kids. Think about all that they've witnessed. Our students of color, the violence they've witnessed, the things that people have said more than ever before over social media because they're trying to defend whiteness and oppression. So we hear more. And so our children really do need these safe places to be able to express their emotion. And right now, I'm really concerned as schools are still driving curriculum, graduation, college and career readiness, that we're just shutting down the emotion, and we're providing an SEL class for them to have 1 hour to talk about their feelings, not really talk about it, but learn how to manage their feelings, when really we need a place of healing.
Thank you. I just want to build off of that. I want to share some words from Prentice Hemphill, who is an amazing, brilliant, healing leader and practitioner and organizer. And it's a few words. I'm going to try to read it slowly, and then I can put the post in the chat box. But they say that the industries of self-help and wellness are centered around managing and controlling white women's intimate and existential anxiety and ensuring white male achievement. What is encouraged, allowed, and invalidated or validated in all of our experiences is shaped by these priorities. So the priorities of managing and controlling white women's intimate and existential anxiety, again, and white male achievement. The real and hard work is reimagining the intentions and parameters of wellness altogether, right? So I think this kind of builds off of what Dina just mentioned in the chat box. It's like, whose emotions are valid in our school spaces? And I think what I want us to invite us to consider is, before we even start talking about students' emotions, how can we sit with our own, right? How can white folks, white women, folks who have privilege in any way, sit with our own emotions and be in the discomfort of what that entails before we actually ask our students to share their emotions with us? Because I think what I'm finding in schooling and in academia is that we're really good at comforting white women and white folks and white tears, right? But when our students of color, when our queer students, when teachers of color speak up through righteous rage or want to grieve, that's not allowed, right? So I think instead of putting the onus on students to actually work through their own emotions, we really need to do that internal work. I think institutions really need to take a look at their own window of tolerance for emotion. You know, oftentimes I see in these SEL training workshops, we borrow from Daniel Siegel's framework of the window of tolerance, which I think is a great tool for us to look at the ways in which stress impacts the way we feel, and then the ways we actually relate and can potentially cause harm to others or ourselves. But I think institutions as a whole need to look at their own window of tolerance, right? Our schools don't have any tolerance for righteous rage or righteous grief or even joy. So what do our schools need to do to actually shift their capacity to be an actual container for the many full range of feelings that our students show up with in our schools?
Thank you, Steph and Zoe and Dina, for sharing. I agree with everything that you have said so far. Something that I would add is that sometimes SEL is seen as a destination, right? A place that we have to go to when it comes to the skills. And it's very much focused on those individual skills that students are supposed to develop. But SEL should be a vehicle to get us somewhere, right? And the place where we are going to SEL, that's where our purpose is grounded. And if our purpose is to continue to maintain the status quo, that is a red flag, right? If we have students of color that are being harmed by these SEL practices, we need to question, what is our purpose? Why are we adopting SEL in our schools and in our communities? So seeing SEL as a vehicle to get us to a place where we can heal, where we can be in community, when students' identities can be affirmed, and not so much focus on like, what are those individual skills, but to see them as something that we can use to get us where we want to go. And that requires that schools look at their purpose and what is that they are trying to accomplish with these practices. And again, if the answer is to manage student behavior, that's another red flag, because SEL, from where I said, is so much more than that. It gives us an opportunity to be in community, to heal, to really center who we are and acknowledge our humanity. But in order to do that, it needs to be driven by a purpose where everybody can come together and work to co-create that space. Otherwise, it's something else. It's behavior management, but it's not SEL.
Excellent. So there's a lot of chat going on in the chat that's really pretty awesome. And there was a question around the prepackaged SEL. And so how can we now negotiate when we are educators working within a specific district? How can we negotiate what we're talking about this morning around something that might be a prepackaged social emotional learning, corporatized kind of SEL program?
I mean, I think teachers have always been doing SEL. And I just also think when we talk about SEL as a construct, it makes it very difficult for us to understand that it's a process and we're always doing it. The same way racial justice is a practice, the same way healing is a practice and process. I think going out along with what you're saying, Laurea, is that it's not, we focus more on the outcomes. And that's why and in education in general, we focus on the outcomes. And so we get scared of the messiness of the process. And as a result, now we're like, we got to assess this because we need to know. And all of that is capitalism, like just corporatizing SEL. But SEL is how we are together. It's how Steph and I can look at each other and understand our histories. I could look at Zoe and appreciate what it means to have indigenous wisdom, or for me, African wisdom, about what it means to feel the full realm and to have the space and safety to feel the full realm of my emotions. And so even within this space of SEL, I think we also have to think about the many ways that we have created trauma on other folks by erasure. I want to name that there are people who've been doing this work for years whose names are not said. Like, we don't talk about Dr. Jim Comer and the work that he's done in SEL. He's a Black man, right? So that's Black erasure. And that happens too often in these spaces when we corporatize them, we forget where it comes from. A lot of SEL, like, SEL is this big thing. Restorative practices get left in there. But that's been co-opted from indigenous communities. We have to talk about, yes, we have to, as Asif said, we have to say their names. And too often the names that we don't say are the names of Black, indigenous folks of color, women. And so I want to make sure I name those names, because too often that erasure is part of the trauma, and it's the irony of being in these spaces. And so, we are at an academic conference. What does that mean? What does it mean to work in a space of academia, of an academic institution? How have academic institutions, instilled trauma on folks, and by leaving folks out, like it's built on exclusion, right? So we want to do all this anti-racism work, which is what Steph said. We need to look at ourselves and make sure the adults are okay. And I want to go back to that. We need to make sure that our BIPOC adults are okay, because, Patricia Williams and my sis Bettina Love talks about the spirit murdering, right? Our spirits need to be well in our spaces. In order for me to do good work, my spirit needs to be well, and I need a well space to go to. And right now, many of these spaces, even the spaces that, claim to be, the gurus of SEL, those spaces are unwell too. And so we have to also, part of this work is that self-awareness, looking within and healing within, because hurt people. And so, I know that, we're out there selling this stuff, but what are we really selling? And I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves. What are we selling?
I think also where we have influence with schools and communities, there's always, I've found every school that I've entered into throughout the Northwest, there's always an advocate, there's a teacher or someone that wants to do more, and they care about their students at such a deep level. And there's several teachers like that. And I think where we can really ask, has the community been involved in the revisions of this SEL curriculum, and start asking a lot of questions is really important. Because, going back to, best practices is integrating it throughout the school, but really embedded in the community, and it should reflect the community. And that's often where, if they're taking these prepackaged programs and they haven't really gotten, feedback and buy-in and from the community, then it's not going to reflect the community's values, and it will be based on Western perspectives. And, I think about, we took a curriculum that, we actually threw the whole curriculum out, because we started with looking at a prepackaged curriculum within the Nez Perce tribe. And one that the tribe really decided to drive the SEL curriculum rather than the schools, and the schools allowed it. There's 4 different school districts. But we took the curriculum and we ran it by several tribal community members. and got their feedback. And they basically scratched almost the entire curriculum. The concepts, we had to really use more traditional language because they don't really capture the concepts of SEL very well. And so we ended up writing a completely different curriculum over a year's time with the community. But they had the community buy-in. So when they started implementing it at the school, they had the family support, they had the community support, which is really the best practice. But I think too often, schools are looking and then they're demanded. I think teachers are also experiencing burnout. And so to do this work is hard work. So I think wherever we can step in as educators, researchers, community members, and help the school in this way, and strongly suggest that if it's not, it will turn into white supremacy if the curriculums aren't adapted, and if there's not training behind it. A lot of training with those who are implementing and teaching, because if we don't model it, you can teach something and you're modeling something different, then you're reinforcing what you're modeling.
Excellent. A question came in on the chat from Christina, and she asks, speaking of erasure, can we talk about students with disabilities? Where are our learners with differences reflected in this narrative?
Anyone else? Laurea?
Yeah, I was actually still thinking about the question, and I just want to kind of double click on something that Zoe said, which is when we do SEL, it's not about teaching a curriculum, right? It is about teaching the students that we have in front of us. So I think that these expectation that we're gonna take this package curriculum and we're gonna teach it, and that's gonna have a certain impact, is an erroneous assumption, because the SEL process is so much more than just taking this curriculum, right? You have to look at the needs of the students that you have in front of you. But I also want to highlight that if we want to create an anti-racist society, that teaching needs to be explicit. And it needs to be explicit in a way that for students of color allows the opportunity to have a healing space, but also for white students to be able to understand what are those systems of oppression and give them tools to fight for a better society, right? So I think that what SEL has missed is that intentionality to teach these things explicitly. And when we are erasing, like Dina was saying, the names of and the contributions of people of color, that's problematic, right? So I think that I go back to that we cannot make assumptions when we are teaching these concepts. We need to be very, very upfront and do it intentionally. So we are really contributing to create these purpose-driven communities where students know that the expectations that we have for that societal expectations that we have for women or men are different, right? And that can be explicitly, where we can have explicit discussion about it. So just want to double click on that intentionality.
Excellent. Does anyone want to, there's more questions coming in, like explicit for whom? I mean, this is a great group of folks here in the chat. So many wonderful questions. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge, like, one of the tensions is, as teachers, we're often given prepackaged curriculum as curriculum. And I think that the point about the process and that this is a process is really important. And a lot of the questions that are coming in, explicit for the educators too, from Almut, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Explicit for the educators too, the SEL process is not what educators have been socialized to do. So how do we change that?
I think I just want to say that, you know, we get, because we think, I think we have to first decolonize what we think school is and what we think schooling is versus what education is. Someone talked about this earlier in the chat. Like, I think school, like, I think we learn outside of the four walls. Like, I've learned more outside of the four walls surviving this world than I did in the school building. Because for me, the school building was very traumatic. So what did I learn to do in school? I learned to survive. Also, when I walk out into the world as a Black woman, I learned to survive. But I think you know, when we think about, you know, chronically ill people, like my twin sister is chronically ill, and she's out of school a lot. Like, how do we begin to think about the diverse experiences and how we connect and make meaningful relationships with people, you know, for people of all abilities and backgrounds? And I think at the core of this is, how do we become culturally responsive and student-centered in this work, right? So if I have a student who is hard of hearing, well, how am I gonna help that student get the material, any type of material? How am I gonna help this student be a part of the community? That's part of the work too. And if, you know, if it's my student who was chronically ill, I remember in high school, I went to boarding school in high school, and I'm so fortunate that I was there with her, because I remember she wasn't there as much as I was. And so she was often excluded from the community. And because she was in their life, she didn't have the opportunity to build the relationships that I was. So I basically said, if you're gonna invite me, you're gonna invite my sister too. And I go back to say that when I was a teacher, I would give my students, speaking of student agency, I would say, you can sit wherever you want to sit, but the class rule is no one gets left out. And so I remember the moment when I was thinking of leaving teaching, and I was in Central Park with my students, and they were playing a game. And at one point they stopped. They saw another student sitting down and they saw me sitting down. I didn't need to play, but they all stopped. They're like, stop, you know, Leandre is not with us. And Miss Simmons, do you guys want to join us? And at that moment, I know that every student was like, they had saw that, like everyone was welcomed in the community. So I would say this work of making sure that we're responsive to all students' abilities, needs, is that we do, as educators, have to constantly do the process and the practice work of being student-centered and culturally responsive, and allowing student agency to be at the core of how we teach. Right? We always teach people what we think they need to know, and we never ask folks, what do you want to learn? Let's do that, because too often we instill this, like, I know what's good for you. And let me tell you, when we do that, we're just practicing and engaging in white supremacy. How do you know what's good for me? You didn't ask me. And too often in education, we tell people, it's too often in academia, we tell people, we use academia as a weapon against people too often as well. And so that's why we have to constantly interrogate. This work, I think, is interrogating self, interrogating and that self-awareness, to ensure that we ourselves and our mindlessness do not instill harm in another's spirit.
Thank you, Dina. I'm just gonna name that it's very early for me, so I'm taking a while to process and be able to jump into this conversation, so forgive me. But as you were talking, Dina, I was thinking of the different dialectical frameworks that mainly that Patrick Kamangyan came up with in the article that we wrote around social emotional learning as just another form of miseducation. Which is another way of saying white supremacy with a hug, right? And one of the dialectics that we talk about, and when I say dialectics, we're talking about how oftentimes when we're teaching young people, we have to deal with the complexities of things, the contradictions in which we're all sitting in. And oftentimes, you know, social emotional learning can just reinforce the ways in which we teach young people to hate themselves, right? How do we engage in curriculum that reinforces self-hate? The idea that I can only engage in this classroom if I calm my feelings down and silence them through meditation or whatever tool that you're using, right? But what I'm hearing from folks is that the power of emotion is actually to learn how to be in relationship to myself, to love myself, to have knowledge of self, that when I engage in whatever behavior, underneath that behavior is a feeling. And underneath that feeling is a need, right? And either that need is being met, or maybe if I have a really big feeling like anger, that means my need is not being met. So for me, that's the power of emotional literacy, to be able to determine how to meet my needs and to be able to hold people accountable when my needs are not being met. And our students are very good at expressing when their needs are not being met, but we don't have the capacity to actually nurture and respond to ways that honor the wholeness that our students come to our classrooms with, right? And then the other thing I'm hearing too is this whole thing around prepackaged curriculum. It's like our students are not worksheets. our students are not bullet points. What I appreciate about approaching, learning with a decolonizing lens is that things are not linear, things are not neat, things are not prepackaged, things are quite messy and complex and contradictory. And so for me, it's like the pedagogy is about building relationship. It's not about meeting outcomes. And so how are we using something like emotions in the classroom as a place for our students to get to love themselves, to recognize that they're already whole, and to create spaces where, we talk about building solidarity with other folks, that my grief, my rage, my joy is not just something that I own individually, but I can tap into that collectively as well with other folks. So yeah, I'll just pause there.
And also going back to what Steph said earlier about the adult social emotional competencies and the capacity that educators have to do this work. And something that I've observed time and time again working with schools is that there's this urgency to bring these skills to students. And many times we skip the educators that are supposed to create these spaces. And I think that if the pandemic has taught us anything, is the dehumanization of the teaching profession and how teachers have been put in under so much stress and teaching almost in impossible circumstances, right? So I think there is a part of humanizing our schools and learning communities that includes accepting and acknowledging the challenges that it comes with being an educator today in the US. And how there's no space for the adult either to bring those emotions, to share their feelings, to talk about the challenges that they encounter on a daily basis. So if we are hoping that the educators do the work for students, we need to start creating those healing communities for the educators first, right? And we know from a recent study that came up, there was an article published in Edutopia that teachers of color are leaving the profession at really high rates because they are feeling the micro, not so micro, right? Racism within school communities, right? So I think that there's a part of this work that needs to be done, starting with the adults. And a lot of the unpacking of this white supremacy with white educators, it's a long process, but it needs to happen. And I think that unless we do this work, again, intentionally, especially with white teachers, it's going to be really hard that those teachers are going to reach students in ways that those students need and support students of color in the ways that they need and they deserve. So I think that, if I have a call today for the audience is to really look at how we are preparing educators to be in the workforce and how we are intentionally not only creating the space to unpack their mindsets and look at their learned beliefs, but also to build the courage and the strength to go into these institutions and do something about dismantling the systems that are oppressing students.
I also want to name that sometimes we can walk away from those colonize, from the trauma of those systems. I think too many of us have seen those systems as the only places to be, and we need to decolonize our minds, thinking that that success only lives within whiteness. That is the first thing. Like, to me, if it were up to me, throw the system away, throw them all away, start anew. Because if we have to begin understanding the foundation and the reason that many of these institutions and constructs are a thing or in existence. I think as we think about this work of SEL, I think the crux of it is really, how do we bring humanity to our interactions? How do I, like, every single day when I'm, advocating for racial justice, all I'm saying is, I need you to see my personhood. I need you to see my humanity, because those of us who are not white, who are, chronically ill, who do not have the ability to move, or, divergent learners, we are constantly dehumanized in schooling spaces. And I think that part of this SEL work, that's why we can't see SEL in silos. Like, we need to understand that this work must be work of justice. Because if we're not doing the justice work, then we are part of the problem, to me, right? So, like, doing that justice work includes, like, folks with different ability, Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks. I think that's the conversations. And we have to also, really look at these institutions, right? And the people who are doing research, and even ask questions about the research we're doing. Because we could use whatever data we want to tell whatever story we want. And if we haven't done the work, we are actually perpetuating research, SEL research, or anything research in education that is perpetuating single narratives of being Indigenous, of Blackness, of whiteness too. And so I think we need to be more expansive and understand that this work really in SEL is justice work, and it must include humanity at the core. Otherwise, it is, I'm going to say it again, white supremacy with a hug. You can't say, Bedina, I meant well, and punch me in the face. Like, I don't care what you meant. I'm hurting. And I think that I need to say that as a Black woman, that I'm hurting, because what we know about the racial empathy gap, you think I can take the pain more. You know, but from back in the day, that enslaved folks were experimented on without painkillers. That is how we're treated today in different ways. So I had to walk away from a place that was killing me. And that place was supposed to be nurturing. And so I think we need to actually have those uncomfortable conversations about this work, because that's where the healing happens. We have to tend to the wounds. So I think part of this work is saying, where are the wounds? And how can we begin to heal those wounds? Who does not get to be a person here? And who does not have the privilege of comfort? I think that's part of the SEL work too.
I want to quote the homie Cam. He says that we have to stop looking to our oppressor for our model of humanity. Like, we can't, going back to Prentice's quote, like, we can't keep thinking about this idea of, like, white achievement as the purpose of SEL. This idea that I'm going to be more employable. I think that's what Zoe talks about right in your article, this idea of SEL as just another form of productivity and capitalism. And I think what I'm thinking also about in terms of the wounds that Dina's talking about, I'm thinking about so many of our critical teachers of color, women of color, Black teachers, Black women, who often get pushed out or are holding so much emotional labor of creating these nurturing spaces, these refuges, these safe spaces for our students. And that if we're going to talk about social emotional learning, we have to understand the ways in which our teachers are just carrying too much and they're putting out too many fires and they're expected to hold spaces for folks, and then undo the damage and do all of these things. I was one of those teachers that got pushed out, and I'm still grieving that loss, right? So I think we also need to talk about the grief of teachers as well, and how many different compounded losses that we experience on a daily basis. Sometimes we literally lose our students, right? And so how do we actually create safe spaces, these refuge spaces, these fugitive spaces where folks can come together and actually feel what we need to feel so that we can replenish ourselves, so that we can then go into our classrooms again and do what we need to do again, right?
So on that note, I kind of want to ask a question here about in Zoe's work. You do a lot around, you use the metaphor of bridges and healing, and I think that maybe asking the question, how can decolonizing SEL education in schools help build bridges of healing and reconciliation for those who've experienced this historical and ongoing racism and discrimination? That I think that this is a really important question, like for us to also look at, like, how can we do this healing piece?
Yeah, I think that question to me is so important. And I think it goes back to what many folks have said already today, is going back to that area of humanity, relationality, I believe, is at the core. And, I think about SEL in ways that if we can take more communal versus independent approaches is so important, because peers and youth have such an incredible ability to support one another, and we know as students develop that they become less interactive in ways with adults and more interactive with their peers, and who has more influence is the youth, and where we can really make a big impact in bridges of healing is if we're spending a lot of time, taking the time to really teach youth how to care about each other, youth, how to care, how to listen, how to develop things from a relational perspective and how to care for one another. We did a series of interviews for almost 300 youth and asked them, and specifically youth that have had high victimization experiences and rates, African American, Native, and Mexican American students, and talked about what helped them, after victimization and ways peers interacted, and they could, they expressed that they had multiple emotions and they could really communicate that well, but they were very clear on what helps them calm their emotions, what helps them reconcile, what helps them to have peace. They know how to help one another. It's just that we're needing to help reinforce that and spend more time with it. And I think about the classrooms and the playgrounds and the lunchrooms. Those are incredible opportunities that if we could create more spaces in school to deal with things as they come, and really attend to those things are so important. Remember being in a classroom where, observing and helping a teacher implement SEL curriculum, because she really did. She just had an incredible heart I want to do more for the students. And this Native student came in, and it was predominantly a non-Native school, and a Native student came in, and I just saw him shaking. And, she was trying to go through the curriculum, and it was so evident that his emotions were like, he was really hurting, he was disturbed. But she just went through the entire class and disregarded it. And not on purpose. I think it's more like, a lot of times people don't know what to do. And I think that's where we need spaces to attend. I walked over to the student and I asked him, do you want to go in the hall and talk? And as we went there, he basically was called a fag on the way to, just in that 5-minute break between classrooms. Called a fag because of his long hair. And I just think about that's what these students are experiencing, even in the halls going from class to class. If you go to stand in the halls and see how they're treating each other, it's so sad. And so I think for us, we need those spaces of thinking about how do we go through emotion, how do we go through our traumas together, not to teach students how to independently manage their emotion, because that's not reality. You think about as adults, how complex our emotions are, how we need our friends, how we need our people to run ideas by and to support us emotionally. It's just not realistic for students to feel this pressure that I need to manage and control and be this certain way when I've just gone through extreme trauma. So I think for us to create spaces to attend to those are really important, and teachers need space to attend to their own emotions, because I don't know, as a parent, if I'm not taking care of myself, I'm irritable and I'm not able to attend to my children. So I hope we can find ways to do that.
I also want to bring something else that I think that anti-racist education is also a pedagogical issue, right? The ways in which we are teaching in our classrooms and what kind of enriching learning is really happening in the experiencing that students of color have when they go to school. So of course, there's that component of everything we have been talking up to this point in terms of their social, their emotional needs and the lack of space that right now is being created. But there's also the pedagogical side, right? What are the kinds of experiences? Are they experiencing challenging pedagogy and challenging learning where they feel supported, but they can work to their fullest potential? I think that is another area that we need to be exploring when we look at decolonizing SEL, because it's also looking at what are those conditions that are being created in the classroom, and what are the kinds of materials and the kinds of curriculum that is being used to support learning. And is that a vehicle for students to really, be in their full humanity and fulfill their fullest potential? Or are we, taming down and really offering impoverished opportunities for them to grow? And I think that needs to be also part of the conversation of how we are, what we are offering to students in our classrooms.
And on that piece, I would also add, how are we also ensuring that our curriculum reflects our students, right? Like, so when we talk about high expectations, I think it's also a social emotional issue to make sure that our students feel like they have some power and voice in what it is that they're doing and what it is that they're learning. It's just my 2 cents, and that's the only 2 cents I'm adding. But that's an awesome question. Does anyone else want to speak on that question, or we have a bunch of other questions from the chat? So
I do want to talk about like who really has in education. And when I talk about education, I'm also talking about educators and the adults in the building, like who really has this space and safety to thrive in these spaces. I also am going to include academia, and then who has to survive these spaces. Because just think about the energy it takes every single day to survive. Like that means that there's less cognitive space for you to thrive, for you to be creative. That's why these spaces need to be spaces where humanity is at the core, where we take the time to really get to know who our community are, who the students are in our classroom, so that they have the privilege of comfort and joy, right? We talked, Laurea, you mentioned earlier that, teachers of color are walking away. What I see that as is that we have a glaring problem that the teachers who walked away did not have the space to thrive. Do you know how much energy it takes to put on a shield every single day? Like that energy that's taken to protect yourself, it's exhausting and it makes us sick. And that's why there's a ton of research about how racism and oppression kills. So these spaces that, you know, I think that's why we need to, again, go back to this self-interrogation, right? Like, honestly, the most insulting thing is seeing the performative aspects, like all the people who decided that May 25th to 2020 was now the time that they were going to do anti-racism work. When before, when there were folks of color saying that this work was important, you were being like, no, that's not our thing. But now all of a sudden it's trendy, it's important, right? I think that's actually part of the trauma that people are experiencing too. It's because where were you before? Why didn't you care about my humanity before there was an audience? And I think that part of this work is really looking at the nuances of opportunities for humanity, right? Take SEL out of it. This work is really about humanity. How does someone go into a place and have the privilege of their full humanness? And that's the work of SEL.
So we are coming in on our last 10 minutes here. And I'm wondering if, and this is an option for the panelists, either I can do a summary, a quick summary, or would you rather leave people with something you would like us to think about individually as we move forward as teachers, as teacher educators, as researchers?
I think
I feel like your voices are better than mine. So
I'm trying to like really integrate all the different things that were shared in this space. And what I'm hearing is that beyond what we call it, SEL, blah, 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 like Dina said, it is about creating and nurturing spaces in which we can be our full expansive selves. And that includes us as teachers and the young people that we're working with. And so I think before we even think about curriculum, which is like the what we teach, I think we also need to consider the structures and policies in our schools, in our education spaces that punish students for being their full range of selves. And also the ways in which we internalize those narratives and we punish ourselves for wanting to be our full selves, to wanting to walk away, to wanting to quit, to wanting to speak out, but being afraid of being reprimanded for speaking through our anger or grief or whatever that we're feeling. And so I think what's important before we even think about like what we're teaching is just like taking an inventory of the ways in which we have these structures in place and these ideas and these beliefs that make us think that our students' humanity is not allowed, right? Is not permissible. But also reflecting on the ways in which we do that to ourselves so that we can then do that for our students as well. How do we stop punishing ourselves? How do we stop punishing ourselves for not meeting so-and-so norms, expectations? And how can we love ourselves fully so that we can also do that for the young people that we love?
thank you, Stephanie. I'm sorry, it's you're making me cry a little bit, because that idea of how do we stop punishing ourselves? How do we make spaces for ourselves for this whole process to kind of maybe re-envision social emotional learning as spaces for healing, as spaces for us to be able to push back, right? To help us kind of look at how do we make spaces to thrive instead of just survive. And I cannot tell you how many notes I have here on this process.
And can I add one more thing?
Please.
Because I'm
Yes.
starting to wake up now. I think I think it's also about accountability. You know, we're in this new exciting moment in which we're talking about abolition and transformative justice. And so I think it's also about part of being our full range of selves is to be able to be accountable to when we cause harm. And so I don't think schools are ready to do that, to be really reconciled with the harm that they have caused historically and in this moment as well. And so because I don't think the institutions are ready to do that, I think we start with ourselves in terms of figuring out what are the ways in which we cause harm to ourselves, to our young people, and being able to repair those things and say, I'm sorry, I don't have the capacity to hold what you're holding right now. I'm sorry, I shushed you. I'm sorry, I didn't have, the patience to actually hold what you're bringing to the classroom right now. How do we make those repairs as well is also really important.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was inspiring. Thank you for the centering event too, just to help us center at the beginning. I think that was a model of, I think, spaces that I want to hold more at, even at higher ed. I think more that we can produce what we're talking about at the teacher education level, in universities we're sending folks to go work in schools and work in communities. And if we can model this ideal, I guess is really what it is, in higher ed, I think people value it. I know I'm serving on a task force for equity policy and practice. And one of the things we've changed the paradigm of how we have a bunch of leaders working together to change policy and practice, but we just take time at the beginning to just share how we're feeling. How is our week going? What's hard? What's difficult? And talk about our emotions, support each other, and not just try to just get into work. And I even found at this beginning of this meeting, I'm so used to what's the agenda, think about all the ways that we have been colonized to feel like, okay, we only have an hour and 15 minutes, so we need to get to it quickly. Do we have time for a centering event? I mean, those are the types of things that we're so used to, and our anxiety can almost increase a little bit, thinking, what is the expectations of you that are joining us today? And are we going to not meet your expectations if we talk about the heart too much, or we don't give you a list of scholars to go and read? And those are all the things that were going through my mind. And I think I want to start really deconstructing that more in my personal way I work in higher ed, because we do have influence. And I know all of you who have joined us today have influence in your field. And I think more we can hold spaces and model this idea of relationality, caring for one another, caring more about who we are rather than what we do. And then the work comes natural. I know there's incredibly talented, smart people here. The work comes natural. So I guess I just leave you with, go back to your workspace and just enjoy people, enjoy yourself, and really make time for relational connections without an agenda as much as possible, and model that, because once people feel that, they're like, this feels good, they want to give it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I just want to thank you all here, everyone who made this possible. One of the things too, this idea of like urgency and not making time for it, that's what we get from schools, but we don't have time for SEL. And we actually have to interrogate where this sense of urgency comes from. Like, urgency is a white supremacy culture tenet. Like, once we start to interrogate where like we have to unlearn and decolonize our minds. And I want to just thank you, Steph, for talking about the importance of accountability. With accountability comes apology with action. And so I'm just going to say that because the SEL space needs to ask also how they created harm and who they created harm on, and apologize for the harm that they created. And then gratitude. Like, how does gratitude no one owes us gratitude, but how does gratitude become part of this work? And so, and then last, I would say, there's a lot of talk, but let's live the work and let's do the work.
Thank you all for sharing. I think that if you are not fired up after this conversation, I don't know. I know that I'm leaving with so much more that I came in this morning. And, I think about two things. One, that as a white person, racism is dehumanizing for all of us, right? So, and this is something that my friend Camila Drummond Forrester says, it also affects white people. So I think that going back to this idea of self-interrogation, to really ask those uncomfortable questions of when you are in meetings, who's not at the table, whose voices are not being heard, right? What groups are being erased from the conversation and from the decision-making process. That's something that we need to include in our practice. And then I also live with the fact that we heal in community. We cannot do this work alone. We have to come together in this space. We need to have these conversations. And I know that I've learned so much from just being in community with others and being able to share and being able to say the things that are scary for me or the things that I'm not sure, and being able to see, to have someone call me in on my blind spots because I don't see them. And now I can have a new light and I can see things differently, from being able to recognize I thought that before and now I think something different, to see that growth as part of this process. So I think that the work continues, and I would encourage the audience to reach out and to continue the conversation because it's very much needed.
Daniel, did you want to make a closing remark? I see you turned your video on.
Well, we are coming up at the end of our time. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for being here today. It looks like, I mean, based on the chat and based on what I heard today, that people are finding this panel to be pretty amazing. So I appreciate that. One of the things that I was just thinking about, and I'll just say this real quick before we sign off, is that we talked a lot about teachers today, but one of the things that's always concerned me is that with these conversations around teacher education is, we can support teachers, but once they get into schools, they also need support from administrators. And so we actually need to talk to administrative programs too, the programs that prepare principals and how they can then support teachers in this way as well. And then also the types of programs that support mentor teachers, cooperating teachers, university supervisors, and induction mentors, which are people who support teachers once they're in the field. It needs to be a collective effort. It can't just sit in teacher ed. It has to sit in several different spaces in order for this to work. So I appreciate the conversation today. I'm going to put a link in the chat to this information doc that I created earlier where you found the Zoom link here. It's a Zoom link, so it's live. So just go to that link and I'm sorry, it's a Google Doc and it's live. So go there. If you want the recording later, I'll update the page with the recording on it. If you'd like to view it later, you won't be able to get it from the AERA website. You'll only be able to do that. There's also a form that you could fill out that's on that info sheet. And if you put your email address on the form, I'll send it to you a little bit later. But thank you so much, Steph, Zoe, Dina, Laurea, and Laura, and also our ASL interpreters for being here today and making this panel so awesome. I'm going to go ahead and end the session now, but thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the AERA conference.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
none of us want to leave. I really so much thank all of you for being such an integral part of, like, this was the best session I've ever attended at any conference in my life, and it's because of your voices. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Danielle, for creating this space and also being so on top of things with the Zoom link and the Google Doc and then the emails, and like, it was a lot to handle and you made it look so good. And just thank you to Steph. Like, I'm like, how do I email her? How do we work to get? Yeah. So
yeah, I would love to continue this conversation. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this space. And, you know, obvious for the rest of the people who are here, thank you so much for your engagement. It's been nice way to start the morning. Well, my morning started before
Oh, thank you, everybody.
Have a good day.
Thank
Enjoy.
you.
Bye.
All right.
All right.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Thank you, Elizabeth, for such hard work. Oh, she's gone. It's just a few of us in